History shapes everything we do and everything we believe. Across the centuries, a few have written the stories of humanity, and in doing so, have silenced countless others. Choke Points Through Time is where those voices are heard again. Join Dr. Wayne Sedlak, linguist, scholar of ancient languages and history, pastor, former missionary to Africa, graduate school dean, and professor, as he opens the door to our forgotten past. From the tablets of lost civilizations to the chronicles of empires long fallen, discover the truths history tried to hide and the forces that still shape our world today. Choke Points Through Time, a journey through the pivotal moments of mankind's story. This is history as you've never heard it before. And now, here is Dr. Wayne Sedlak.
Hello again. I'd like to welcome you to yet another Choke Points Through Time. We've been studying in this mini-series the lies that have been taught to us, often in the classroom, but media, government, authors, historians, scientists have all joined in to the general cacophony of falsehoods. I'd like to remind all of you, by way of announcement, that on September 8th, Tuesday, September 8th, we are beginning our economics class. So do go to Vision Viewpoint, bring down the menu tab of the coursework, and you can sign up there to participate in the every Tuesday and every Thursday from 1 to 2:30 p.m. in the afternoon, of course, Central Time. That's Central Time, not Eastern, not Mountain, not Pacific, but Central Time. Love to have you there, and if you do take the course then, there's no payment whatsoever. It's free. I assure you, you will not be disappointed. You see, I say that because we are living in a time where the economic side of things is almost completely dominated by the left side of the political and economic aisle. Most Christians, and especially the pastors, sad to say, and certainly many conservatives, simply do not understand the science of money. The science of money is, you might say, there's economics, and then there's the more advanced economics. Well, we're not going to treat it quite like that. Science of money simply shows how wisdom is applied, either good or bad. When we call bad wisdom, we mean cunning. How those who are cunning use economic traps, snares, enticements, and the results to flank us. You'll learn that. This is for anyone, any adults, and of course we use it for homeschooling young people across the country. Actually, it's been taught on 2 continents. So you're welcome, and invite your friends, invite people at your church, put up a notice on your church bulletin board, have it announced, if it's allowed, from the pulpit. Spread the word throughout the congregation and beyond. We begin that Tuesday, the week of September 8th, Tuesday and Thursday, for the science of money and economics. Remember, it's often called the dismal science for a reason. Because Christ is not in it, it will be dismal. But that simply means that the cunning side of those who might be called chokmah, wise, the Bible speaks of those that are chokmah, wise and upright, and those that are chokmah, who are cunning, diabolical. Satan, in fact, is called wiser than Daniel. Now, obviously, that kind of cunning is where the science of money is often abused, and the opposite, where God gives his people wise counsels. In fact, James says, if you want to be wise, ask the Lord. He'll freely give it to you. Now, it's a gift. How you get there? Well, this is one of the ways, because this particular course is going to teach it from the Scriptures. We're going to have, you might say, 3 legs to this thing in each episode, each lesson. One, the scriptural reference. Two, the economic laws or the laws of human action. And three, you'll see there some cunning or brilliant, depending upon the moral character of the money science that's involved. The biblical and the economic side is one thing. Then we're going to be putting each lesson to history, particularly American history. So those who haven't had American history, this is your chance. If you didn't understand history, you haven't had that course as yet, here's an opportunity because we're going to go through American history. What better country to study than the one we're trying to defend? More to the point, God blessed this nation with an abundance of wealth, money. Of course, what we've done with it, the last couple of decades has been a travesty in particular, not to mention the tragedy of slavery. And we'll see how that tragedy of slavery was in fact perpetuated by a few people up on Wall Street. You heard me correctly. Up on Wall Street is where slavery was defended. Not, well, down in the South, yes, but many of the slave owners wanted to get out of slavery. You see, it was becoming an economic snare. But they couldn't get out of their contracts and the punishments thereof. And one of our forefathers, who I have no admiration for, Alexander Hamilton, was one of those that perpetuated those kinds of contracts. And there's much more to it. It wasn't just simply the ensnarement of bad contract or contracts that were designed to snare plantation owners. Plantations themselves became economically unfeasible as the 19th century, the 1800s rolled along. But unfortunately, the slave institution was ended in America through a war. It could have been ended had the church not been interfered with, obstructed by Alexander Hamilton and his partners up on the Tontine Cafe, which later became the financial section of Wall Street. The money power. You see the economics again? The science of money was used in a very advanced way to keep slavery in place. We will study that. It was not the church, by and large, that did that. The slaveholders, many of them were freeing their slaves, or at least allowing them contractually to go live somewhere else. We'll study all of that and much more. But there's, like I said, there's much to learn because throughout history, when the church has advanced and has, in fact, freed peoples, we lose the battle down the road to bad economics, the abusers of the money science. And we are doing so today. It is the money science that has Americans snared. Politically, we may be victorious temporarily. We may get some people elected. That'll turn things around at least temporarily. But if the money problem is not corrected, all else will fail. And the churches, what do they do about it? They're silent. Time to end that silence. So join us week of September 8th, the Tuesday and Thursday of that week, and that point on, every week, when you can. We'll be live, and we will study that flank, the money science, that keeps on, in its abuse, keeps on out-quicking. We just get out-quicked, as they say in the football field, by the money science. And then the church gets demoralized and wearied, beaten, and she begins to slide. Well, enough for that. That is our announcement. And again, spread the word. Now, let me take you back to the year 218 BC. We'll just go there briefly because in that year, Hannibal famously crossed the Alps with 37 elephants and about 40,000 men and a whole slew of cavalry. I'm not interested so much in the fact that he came down and began his invasion of northern Italy, won the Battle of Trebia, but I am interested in those elephants, believe it or not. See, elephants don't do well when it comes to snow and ice and deep, cold weather. They get sick. They don't have the kind of capacity to resist the cold, which is why most elephants are along the equator, in those hot zones surrounding the equator. Well, Hannibal's elephants, 37 of them came down, and he used them at the Battle of Trebia to defeat the Romans. But afterwards, days later, there came a severe frost, a blizzard, in fact, and all but one of the elephants died. They simply can't handle it. They had already been weakened by their crossing the Alps, which at some of those elevations, of course, there's a lot of snow there too. So they were badly weakened. And that's why the resultant blizzard took them all out but one. The elephant called Suras, which became Hannibal's elephant. Hannibal himself was so sick he had an eye infection, lost sight in his eye. All that by way of introduction. You see, we are told by many today that the Apostle Peter, in fact, prophetically says that there are those who will state that, where is the promise of his coming? Christ will be delaying his coming. He has certainly done that. And there have been so many prophecies of Christ's second coming, false prophecies, that a whole generation, actually a couple, have arisen. They say, well, where's the promise of his coming? That's pretty exact, describing these latter days, isn't it? For since the fathers have fallen asleep, all things continue as they have been since the beginning of time. That's called, in scientific circles, uniformitarianism. That all the Bible stuff aside, they say, things have pretty much been continuing on in a uniform manner. Uniform meaning nature continues to be nature as we know it. And that the things of the Old and New Testament, the miracles, well, we can ignore them. That's, in fact, part of the uniformitarian position. Thomas Huxley, a friend of Charles Darwin, was very famous for using that argument. It's a clumsy name, uniformitarianism, but it was predicted right there in 2 Peter chapter 2. Why do I bring all this up? Peter makes a statement concerning the era that preceded Noah. We're told, and God spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. And then it goes on to describe Sodom and Gomorrah. The world of that day, the world that then was, is the way Peter describes it. The world, that old world, the world that then was, changed drastically, according to Peter. So for all the climate change experts purportedly today, they missed the greatest one that occurred somewhere about 3,000, maybe a little bit closer, about 2,500 BC. The world that then was in upheaval. Back to the elephants. We find all throughout Siberia and the Arctic Circle a number of phenomena, not the least of which have been hundreds of woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos. Don't let the woolly part fool you. That doesn't mean that they were living in cold climates. No more than the wool coating on a sheep means that they must outlive cold climates. They're found all over the earth. Woolly mammoths were living actually in a much warmer, more temperate environment. But something suddenly happened. That something left mammoth after rhinoceros and other animals frozen, suddenly frozen. Now, as I said, elephants and mammoths, well, elephants don't do well in the cold. Well, those mammoths weren't living in cold, but they were found underneath the ice, glaciation, frozen. In fact, so frozen they were quick frozen. Food was still in their mouth. We know that they died of asphyxiation and, in fact, of crushing weights upon them. How do we know that? Well, it's a little embarrassing, but the mammoths, the male mammoths, when they suffocate, their sex organ is erect. But also, many of them were crushed. The Berezovka mammoth is maybe the most famous of them all. The frozen Berezovka mammoth, which is displayed in the Zoological Museum, St. Petersburg, Russia, is shown in a struggling position, upright. And again, the sex organ shows he suffocated. But it also shows his entire body went into a thermal deep freeze, suddenly. And rhinoceros, woolly rhinos, and many mammoths, same phenomena. All throughout the Arctic Circle, all throughout the Greenland, northern Greenland. Well, the Arctic Circle is the biggest one in Siberia. But we have found all throughout that region that there was literally millions of elephants, rhinos, animals that live down near the equator now. There's not the plant life to sustain them, yet that's they lived on. In fact, inside the stomach and in the mouth of these mammoths, the Berezovka mammoth, for example, they find fresh plant life that isn't found anywhere near there today. There's two models to interpret all this. One is the unbelieving model, that all things have continued since they have been since the beginning of time. Uniformitarianism, which says that, the Arctic Circle's always been cold. Siberia's always been cold. We're challenging that theory. And Antarctica, that's another subject. We'll save that one for, again, another time. How do these animals that can't live in the cold eat food that is not found up there? The nearest kind of plant life that these have been found in their stomachs or in their mouths are hundreds of miles south of Siberia. How's that possible? You see, there was a sudden change. There's a sudden change in the climate. The old world, as Peter says, the world that then was, perished. And it perished suddenly. We've mentioned on this very program the theory of evolution, and now uniformitarianism simply doesn't work. Those theories don't work. If they're believed, then they're designed to create moral degradation under the guise of scientific survival of the fittest. If you teach kids that survival of the fittest is the law of life, they're going to go on ahead and do it. But what if it isn't? In fact, it isn't. The mammoths and the rhinos, they're the biggest ones that survived. So it said they were suddenly frozen and covered in a deep freeze. Often they're covered in muck, a muck that covers, as I understand it. Now, I'm not just talking about mud. I'm talking about specialized muck that covers about 1/7 of the geological landmass of the world. Most of it found up there in Siberia, inside the Arctic Circle, and down in Siberia, south of the Arctic Circle, and also in other places like Alaska, Greenland. Scientists, geologists don't know where the muck came from. Our model, however, teaches us. If you recall, I talked about the large crater, volcanic crater, that is Yellowstone Park. Not a crater in Yellowstone. I mean the entire park is nestled inside an ancient volcanic crater. There are about 7 or 8 of those craters surrounding it. And scientists can calculate the amount of ash that this threw up into the atmosphere. The amount of ash thrown up by these craters traveled around halfway around the world, maybe further. But what they did was they suddenly blocked out the sun. There were hundreds of these that went off around the world. So imagine the amount of ash from hundreds of them blocking the sun's sunlight. At some point, with the sun's sunlight not being able to get through, temperatures plummeted. There were also massive geysers. The fountains of the Great Deep erupted. Now, originally, they were shooting up water and mud, by the way, shooting up water and mud into the atmosphere. So powerful they were. But when they came back down, they formed a massive hailstorm all over the earth. Now, when God judges, He knows how to get the job done. The snow, the ice, the sudden drop in temperature to minus 150 degrees Fahrenheit was too much. These animals suffocated. They're inhaling ash. Or they can't get the oxygen they need. The blinding elements, be it hail, be it ash, heavy snows from the rainfall turning into snow, they suffocated. Hence their genitalia. And it was not in one like the Berezovka mammoth, who shows signs of struggling. He was eating peacefully and then he struggled. He's struggling to stay alive. But he couldn't. His death was in a matter of minutes. And then he was deep frozen. We know that they're all deep frozen because the meat can still be eaten. At least that's what I understand. The internal meat can still be eaten. And what about the food problem? Well, it shows that the northern latitudes once had an entirely different kind of climate. And then it became deep frozen. Frozen tundra, ice caps, glaciers, all that from the hundreds of volcanic eruptions. Now that wiped out the elephants. They can't survive that. They can't survive like Hannibal's elephants, they can't survive a winter. Well, as it turns out, nothing really could. But the reason I brought up Hannibal's elephants is because the uniformitarian model says that all things have been since the beginning of time. So how are these elephants, according to that model, forgetting the flood and all that I just said, living in the Arctic, because that's what uniformitarianism believes? All things continue as they have been since the beginning of time. How can the elephants be up there, living in the Arctic Circle or the Siberian tundra, in those kinds of inclement, cold circumstances, living up there? How can they do that? Elephants can't live in it. Woolly rhinos can't survive in it. That's why they're down south in Africa. So the uniformitarian model, just with respect to what we saw with respect to dinosaurs, doesn't work. Now, just the mammoths and the Arctic Circle, that can't have happened. It would only take one such elephant, deep frozen, to make the point. We have hundreds of them or pieces of them. For example, there was a deep freeze that went on in a river. In fact, many rivers, but one in particular makes it so famous. Cattle were in a panic, swimming across the river, and it deep froze. We can see their heads barely because over the many, many centuries, the flesh of the heads have been eaten by wolves and other critters, I'm sure. But their bodies are preserved and have been preserved for millennia underneath the deep frozen river. How do you explain the deep freeze? They didn't plunge into an ice-filled river. They are deep frozen and in the process of swimming when their limbs stopped, in the position of their legs, swimming. You know, that doesn't work in a uniformitarian world. I mentioned that the muck is something that geologists have a hard time with. Well, they can't explain why 1/7 of the world, primarily the landmass of the world, has muck all over it. It's a combination of mud and dead plant life that's been frozen over or cold and thaws. Much of it in Siberia, again. Siberia, the Arctic Circle. Where'd it all come from? You know, the ash had to go somewhere. That ash from the volcanoes fell. The mud from the geysers that blew, they didn't throw up clean water, you go take a sip. These were geysers that shot into the air thousands of feet. They're still actually erupting, but they're shooting up just a matter of maybe 5 or 10 feet at most underneath the surface of the oceans, because the oceans began to fill from the seafloor up as the rain was pouring down. But the geysers, there were thousands of them. When they blew, the water and the mud they brought up, the sediment, and, arguably the sea animals, all that blew into the air and settled. Apparently, the activity around the world for this to remain more permanent, a fixture, happened where the deep freeze stayed. The Ice Age, what we're talking about, came as a result of these climatic conditions. And much of the Ice Age rolled down into, it is now a big part of North America. Then it stopped and rolled back over time. And we know that men lived during that age. In fact, men have lived, Adam's descendants lived through all this and more. But around the world, the muck and the mud, the geyser activity, the water, all rolled off. It was absorbed, evaporated. Much of it became, farmland, in fact, now. But up in the north, it was compounded by log jams. There were forests up in the tundra. There's another phenomenon. There are trees up there, long since dead, massive, tens of thousands of tree logs. Not from the logging industry. These have been frozen, and they jam up along the northern part of the shoreline, the Arctic Circle. They jammed up many of the riverways. Where'd all that timber come from? You see, you don't find those forests up there anymore. But they were once there, and they were all ruined. taken out, destroyed by all the activity we just described. The animals were buried. The muck was buried. The timber, the forests, the rich forests were buried. You don't find those forests except now hundreds, maybe 1,000 miles south of all this. But if the uniformitarian model's true, there were rich forests up there. What happened to them? What happened to the Arctic? Deep freeze. How did that possibly occur? You might say, well, what do the scientists say about it? Nothing. It's very common for unbelieving systems to categorize and to isolate a problem over here and discuss it, stick it in a museum and discuss it as if it's its own little world, isolate it over there. In fact, that's what we do. When we process things, one of the ways in which we suppress the truth in unrighteousness, that's Paul's wording, Romans 1. It doesn't just mean we push it down and forget about it. Very often what we do is we put it in its own little cubbyhole, and we can address it not as part of an overall system or worldview, but unto itself like its own statue or its own marble piece or its own museum. And that's what they've done. But they ignore the worldview issue. You see, this is what we need to bring forward. This isn't all, by the way. And by the way, there are photographs of these things. The facts, to be facts, needed conditions that don't match the uniformitarian model. Now what I see, and I see a lot of it on television, I don't watch that much, but what I have seen in the movies over the past 15 to 20 years, there's kind of a subtle move toward catastrophism. See, what scientists have done with the biblical creation model, they got outgunned in debates around the world. They dubbed it catastrophism, and that's okay, meaning our view implies a great catastrophe, which would be the flood, then the subsequent ice age and all that. God's judgment was a catastrophe. But what I now see is in the movies and all that, we're seeing all these things about meteors, asteroids are going to hit us, super volcanoes. In fact, there's a lot of concern about that in Yellowstone again. About worldwide floods and tsunamis that are 1,000 feet high and all that goes with it. Sudden winters that descend upon whole regions. You see, what they're doing is they're placing in the mind of their viewers catastrophe. Without Christ, without the biblical record, without the flood, they've subtly brought it in so they can explain while keeping their evolutionary theory. Catastrophe, part of the things as they have been since the beginning of time. No longer as much the uniformitarian model. When I was a kid, that was all the rage, but catastrophism has come into its own in the last 15 to 20 years. They don't even tell you that. Scientists may, among themselves. But their whole theory of uniformitarianism took one hit after another from creation scientists, such as Dr. Duane Gish, Dr. Henry Morris, writers of the Genesis Flood, a famous book came out in 1959, 1960, by Whitcomb and Morris, and many others. You see, they have to replace it, and they did so with a Christless catastrophism. That's what they did. Too many facts beg a worldview of God's judgment. Catastrophism, their version of catastrophism, by the way, is mindless. They have to appeal to laws of nature, and there aren't those laws of nature like they need. They have catastrophes. We all know about Mount St. Helens, 1980. Krakatoa that went off down in Indonesia. There have been great earthquakes, record floods, of course. But most of those are regional. Large regions at times, but regional. And so the catastrophism that they need, they posit for the entire earth in their movies. They can't do it without Christ. And the design of it, which the geological record, which the biological record, which the thermo freeze, the ash, the creation of the muck, the geysers, and by the way, the tectonic activity, those plates, the rise of the mountains, Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and about 40,000 miles of such ridges all over, mountain formation. The sudden rise of mountains, they can't account for all of that in their models, even their catastrophic models. Because at some point, they're arguing if they go too far, you can do an overlay what they would end up believing with the Bible. They'd be stuck with the fact that the Bible anticipated their thinking. In other words, there is a God to the design, even of the catastrophes. Bear this in mind. Peter says to weigh it carefully. Listen to the prophets and the apostles, he says, that chapter. And understand that God is long-suffering, and some men, they count as slackness. He counts as long-suffering. But once his patience was done, the world that then was perished. In fact, land life, man, was probably gone in a matter of minutes. We need to bow our head and fear our God, who has told us to honor and obey his Son and what he did on the cross for us, taking our sins upon himself and imputing to us an undeserved righteousness that is his. He earned us. We've earned nothing. It is by grace through faith that we come unto him for the forgiveness of our sins, and those sins, according as he describes them in his word. May God bless you. Hope to see you in September.
This has been Choke Points Through Time with Dr. Wayne Sedlak. Visit us at visionviewpoint.com, where you'll find a host of articles, books, and videos designed to answer any questions you may have. Join us Tuesdays and Fridays for Choke Points Through Time with Dr. Wayne Sedlak.